The first time I realized our perfect gated community was built on control, not comfort, it started with a paint chip. I watched a stranger crouch at the edge of my front lawn, holding a tiny square of paper against the grass, like they were comparing my turf to a color card at a hardware store. 2 days later, I was staring at a letter from the association demanding I spend $1,500 to correct my front yard before Thursday. The whole thing boiled down to one question in my head: could that tiny paint chip photo really be enough to force us into debt by the end of the week? If you have ever dealt with HOA ridiculous rules, you already know the answer feels less like a maybe and more like a threat. Our neighborhood, Maple Ridge Estates, was the kind of place real estate photographers love: identical homes, manicured shrubs, and a gate that clicked shut behind you with a smug little beep. From the outside, it looked safe, peaceful, and expensive in that aspirational catalog way. On the inside, once you actually lived behind that gate, you started to realize that every square inch of color, texture, and sound had a rule tied around its neck. When my story started, I was still naive enough to think rules meant fairness. We had moved in because we believed the association would keep things clean and keep property values stable. I pictured friendly neighbors, block parties, and maybe an occasional strongly worded email about trash cans left out too long. I did not picture a board president holding our financial stability hostage over the exact shade of green on my front lawn. What nobody tells you before you sign all those closing documents is that the thick binder labeled covenants, conditions, and restrictions is less of a guideline and more of a weapon waiting for the right pair of hands. Ours ended up in the hands of a woman I will call the president, a person who seemed to wake up every morning looking for the tiniest sign that someone, somewhere, might be enjoying their property a little too freely. At the time, though, I had no idea the binders section numbered CCR section 5.2, exterior aesthetics, front turf was going to become the center of my life for months. The letter demanding we repaint our lawn by Thursday was not the beginning. It was just the first time the association finally dropped the mask. By then, we already had a long, petty history with them. It all began the day we decided our grass did not have to look like every other lawn in the neighborhood. We moved into Maple Ridge Estates in early April, right as the weather was warming up and the sprinklers hissed to life across the neighborhood each morning. The houses all looked like siblings, different enough to tell apart if you stared, but basically wearing the same outfit. Same beige stucco, same dark brown roofs, same approved bushes planted in the same approved patterns. Even the lawns looked like they had been copy-pasted from a single photograph, the same single shade of bright, almost artificial green stretching from one property line to the next. At first, I thought that was comforting. My spouse and I had saved for years to buy here, and part of the appeal was that standard of appearance the realtor kept bragging about. We were told the association took care of things, that there was an architectural committee to ensure consistency, and that any major changes just needed to go through them for approval. It sounded reasonable, the way rules often do when nobody is actually applying them to you. We met our neighbors in quick little bursts, a wave at the mailbox, a nod at the shared dog walking path, a quick mention of trash days. What we noticed even faster, though, was the presence of the president. She walked the streets with a clipboard, a phone, and a permanent expression that looked like someone had just scuffed her favorite pair of shoes. She never really greeted anyone, she just observed. Cars parked slightly crooked got written down. Trash cans an inch past the sidewalk line got photographed. And if your grass looked even a little dry, she would linger an extra second longer, like she could will it to die faster. I remember the first time we noticed a violation notice on someone else's door. It was a bright yellow slip tucked behind their handle, fluttering in the warm breeze. Later, I noticed the same color copy inside my own welcome packet of binder, a sample violation notice with big bold letters and a small note at the bottom that said violation history may affect future approvals. At the time, I barely gave it a second thought. The binder itself was a small horror show for anyone who values personal taste. There was a full-page table showing approved front lawn treatments, listing everything from standard seeded grass to specific brands of turf, each given a number and an approved Pantone-like color reference. In the top right corner of one page, under CCR section 5.2, there was a line that said non-standard color tones may be considered non-compliant at the discretion of the board. It was such a vague phrase that I brushed past it. I figured it meant neon purple lawns or fake checkerboard patterns, not a slightly deeper shade of green. My first brush with the president came about a week after we moved in. I was pulling weeds along the side yard when I felt someone watching me. When I looked up, she was standing near the sidewalk, eyes on the trash bin that was still waiting to be dragged in from the curb. Without saying anything, she tapped something on her phone, gave me a tight nod, and walked away. The next day, we got a courtesy reminder tucked into our door, explaining the requirement to pull trash bins in by 9 p.m. on collection day. That was the first time I felt a little pinch of irritation. We had barely settled in, and already we were on a list. It did not feel like community, it felt like surveillance. But we wanted to make it work, so we adjusted. Trash bins in by 8, lawn cut every Thursday, Christmas lights down by January 2nd. As spring slipped into early summer, though, one thing kept bothering me. Our water bill was climbing, even though we were trying to be careful. The neighborhood landscapers were spraying, mowing, watering, and edging like they were working on a golf course. The grass stayed bright green, but our conscience and our wallet both felt a little shredded. That was when I started researching alternatives. I learned about drought-resistant turf, about grass blends that could stay green with less water, and about subtle color variations that could reduce glare in the sun. One option caught my eye, a turf blend that had a slightly deeper shade, still green, still natural, but with a cool undertone that made it look lush even in harsher light. From most angles, it looked like a regular lawn that had just been well cared for. Only up close could you see the color had more depth than the standard template around us. I checked the binder again. The approved turf list showed a few options, and one of them had a description that sounded almost identical to the product I was interested in. The exact brand name was different, but the color reference number was just one digit off. I saw that same vague phrase again, non-standard color tones may be considered non-compliant at the discretion of the board. I read it twice, then a third time, telling myself that as long as we submitted the proper form, the architectural committee could approve it. So I did everything the right way. I filled out the architectural change request form, stapled printed photos of the proposed turf, and attached a color sample card with the manufacturer's specifications. I made a copy of our submission and noted the date at the top. It felt like I was filing a legal motion, not asking to change the grass in front of my home. I dropped the form at the association office window, where the property manager accepted it without much interest. She told me, in a flat voice, that the committee usually met once a month and that I would receive a decision by mail within 30 days. She did not mention that the president chaired that committee. Weeks passed. During that time, I kept an eye on my mailbox, expecting some kind of response. Instead, all I got were generic newsletters and meeting agendas. One of those agendas, a neatly photocopied board agenda excerpt, mentioned review of lawn color consistency as a discussion item. My stomach tightened when I saw it, but there was no mention of my name or address anywhere on the page. One late afternoon, as the sun slid low and painted long shadows across the identical driveways, the property manager stopped her golf cart in front of our house. She stayed for only a minute, tapping on her tablet, glancing between our existing lawn and the front door. I walked out to greet her, but by the time I reached the walkway, she was already cruising away. Later that evening, I noticed a small white envelope in our mailbox, with the association's logo in the corner. It was not an approval and not exactly a denial. It was labeled a conditional acknowledgement, saying our request was under consideration and that no work should begin until final written approval was issued. There was a line near the bottom, printed faintly, that said failure to comply may result in enforcement action pursuant to CCR Section 5.2. No clear yes, no clear no, just a tepid maybe and a threat tucked in the fine print. My spouse and I talked it through. The turf company had given us a limited time quote, and waiting another month meant losing the discount and pushing installation into the hottest stretch of summer. We had paperwork, proof that the request was being considered, and the product was nearly identical to one of their approved options. The way we saw it, the association had plenty of time to say no if they wanted to. Instead, they gave us nothing useful except a hedge of vague language. We decided to move forward. The installers came on a bright Saturday morning, their truck rumbling down the quiet street as some neighbors peeked through blinds. The old lawn was tired and patchy. By noon, it was stripped away, rolled back like worn-out carpet. By late afternoon, the new turf was in place, a rich, even green that looked soft under the sunlight. It did not look wild or outrageous, it just looked healthy and new. For a few days, everything was calm. Neighbors walked past and slowed down for a better look. A couple of them gave small approving nods. I noticed kids glancing back over their shoulders as their parents steered them along the sidewalk, probably imagining how soft it would feel under bare feet. I let myself believe we had threaded the needle: better lawn, lower water bill, and no real fuss. The president shattered that illusion the same week. I saw her sedan creeping past our house more than usual. Once, she stopped at the corner and sat there, staring at our front yard, fingers drumming on the steering wheel. Another time, I saw her step out of the car with a clipboard in hand, tilt her head, and narrow her eyes at the grass like it had personally offended her. 2 mornings later, I looked out the front window and saw someone I did not recognize standing at the edge of our property line. They wore a polo with the association's logo and held that tiny paint chip card, pressing it against a patch of turf near the sidewalk. They crouched, adjusted, and took several photos with their phone. The camera made a soft, repetitive click in the stillness of the morning air. That was when it hit me: someone had turned our lawn into a case file. It was no longer just grass. It was evidence. What I did not know yet was that those photos and that little paint chip were about to become the centerpiece of a Thursday deadline that threatened to drain $1,500 from our savings and stain our record with the association for years. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was routine documentation, I thought. Maybe they were updating records or verifying that the new turf matched their standards. But small signs kept stacking up: the president driving by slower, the property manager glancing away whenever I waved, and brief, quiet huddles near the association office. A few days later, on a hot, still afternoon, our doorbell rang. By the time I reached the door, whoever had pressed it was gone. In their place, hanging from the handle, was a clear plastic sleeve containing a folded document stamped in red. I slid it out, heart starting to race before I even saw the words. It was a notice of non-compliance. The letter said that our front lawn was in violation of CCR Section 5.2 due to an unapproved non-standard color tone. It went on to say that an inspection had determined the turf installed did not conform to the association's approved aesthetic standards and that we were required to restore conformity by replacing it with an approved lawn treatment. The estimated cost to restore compliance, according to their own note, would be approximately $1,500. The worst part was the deadline. At the bottom of the page, in a larger font, it stated that all corrective action had to be completed before Thursday of the following week. If we failed to comply, the association reserved the right to impose fines, suspend certain privileges, and pursue further enforcement actions. It read less like a neighborly reminder and more like a legal threat dressed up in suburban stationery. The letter referenced a recent photographic assessment and documented color deviation supported by internal records. I realized they were talking about those morning photos with the paint chip. Our lawn was being judged against a tiny square of color that nobody had ever mentioned to us when we submitted our request. My first instinct was disbelief, then anger. We had filed the proper form, supplied photos, and waited. They had sent a half answer, told us nothing concrete, then swooped in after the work was done to declare it non-compliant. The president had waited until the change was in place and the money was spent before calling it a violation. I sat at the dining table, letters spread out, and grabbed the binder from the cabinet. I flipped back to CCR Section 5.2, tracing the lines with my finger. There was nothing specifying an exact color number. There was only that vague phrase again, handing control to the board's discretion. The more I stared at it, the more it felt like a trap hidden in plain sight. I studied the letter again and noticed an attachment behind the main page, a small chart showing 3 photos of turf. The first 2 were labeled compliant, the third, a slightly deeper shade, was labeled non-compliant. The third image looked eerily similar to our front yard. Someone had clearly decided that my lawn fell into that third category, and now they had built an official-looking case around it. The last line of the notice said our response must be submitted in writing within 10 days, even though the physical correction had to happen before Thursday. It was a deadline designed to favor them twice: move fast with money, and fall behind with paperwork. They got to be rigid about timing while hiding behind their process. I felt something settle inside me then, something cold and steady. This was not just about grass shade anymore. It was about control, and about whether the association could push us around using rules they barely bothered to explain. If they could do this over a slightly different shade of green, what else could they do? What else were they already doing to people who did not have the time, money, or energy to push back? I knew we could not just ignore the letter. Non-compliance meant fines, and fines could turn into liens if you were unlucky or stubborn enough. People talk about neighbors from hell like it is always the loud guy next door or the person with the barking dog. In places like Maple Ridge Estates, sometimes the real neighbor from hell is the board itself. The sun had dipped low while I read and reread that notice, and the lawn outside glowed in the early evening light. From the sidewalk, it probably looked beautiful, maybe even better than any other yard on our street. Inside our house, though, it suddenly felt like a crime scene, every blade of grass a piece of evidence in a case we had not agreed to join. The association wanted compliance. They wanted a check, a brand new lawn rolled out by Thursday, and a quiet homeowner who learned their lesson. Instead, as I stacked the notice on top of the binder and slipped both into a folder I labeled Lawn Dispute, I realized something else. We were not going to roll over for this. We were going to push back. We just had to figure out how to turn their own process against them. I started by doing the one thing the association always claimed to want from homeowners: I read everything. I spread the notice of non-compliance, the binder, and that board agenda excerpt across our dining table like a crime board. The more I read, the clearer it became that they were leaning hard on one vague phrase and ignoring every obligation on their side. They had never given us a clear denial, never specified an exact color standard, and yet somehow they had already decided we were guilty. Our first move was simple: we drafted a written response. We kept it polite, but every sentence was anchored to something in their own documents. We referenced the date we submitted the architectural change request, noted their conditional acknowledgement, and pointed out the lack of any clear denial. We asked for the name of the person who had conducted the photographic assessment and for the association's documented standards for acceptable turf color, not just a description, but the actual numeric values. We printed the letter, signed it, and hand-delivered a copy to the association office. Because I no longer trusted lost paperwork as a hypothetical, I also took photos of the envelope on the office counter and emailed a scanned copy to the official address. In that email, I requested written confirmation of receipt. If they wanted to turn this into a file, I was going to build one too. The corrective deadline was still looming, the work had to be done before Thursday, and the letter had arrived the previous Friday. The clock was already ticking, and they knew it. They were betting that we would panic, cut a check, and scramble to install something they liked better. Instead, we decided to hold position. We did not start tearing up the lawn. We did not hire anyone to restore conformity. We waited for a response to our letter, checking email and regular mail like it was exam results. In the meantime, I started talking quietly to neighbors I trusted, testing the waters to see if we were the only ones feeling hunted. What I heard from them made our situation feel less like an isolated problem and more like a pattern. One neighbor mentioned a time they repainted their front door a slightly warmer shade of beige and got a violation 2 weeks later, even though they had submitted the proper form. Another described being forced to remove a small decorative border along their flower bed because it disrupted visual continuity. They all said the same thing: the president seemed to enforce rules selectively, and once she focused on you, it was hard to get off her radar. One neighbor, a quiet guy at the end of the street, told me he had once asked for a copy of the association's internal standards after they cited him for a minor change. He never got anything beyond the public binder we already had. He said it felt like they made up the rules as they went, hiding behind phrases like, "at the discretion of the board," whenever anyone pushed back. Hearing that, my suspicion hardened into certainty. The association finally responded to our letter on Monday afternoon, in the most passive way possible. An email showed up in my inbox from the property manager. It was short, formal, and maddeningly vague. They confirmed receipt of our correspondence, reiterated that they believed we were non-compliant based on a visual and photographic assessment, and declined to provide any specific numeric color standards, claiming such information was internal guidance. They did, however, attach one new document. It was labeled Internal Inspection Summary and referenced our address, the date of the turf installation, and a note that said lawn color deviates from established standard sample by more than acceptable threshold. There was no mention of what that threshold actually was. It was as if they had measured us against a ruler they refused to show. I read that line again and again. Internal guidance. Acceptable threshold. All the power lived in those phrases, invisible and impossible to challenge directly. If they could hide the standards, they could always insist we had failed to meet them, no matter what we did. The deadline was now 3 days away. Thursday was approaching, and with it the implied threat of fines and more serious enforcement. We sat at the table that night, surrounded by paper, and realized we had a choice. We could back down, pay the money, and accept that the president's personal preferences would dictate our property forever. Or we could turn this into something bigger than a turf dispute and prove that the association could not hide behind its own secrecy. We decided on the second option. If they were going to escalate, so were we. We just needed to choose our battlefield. I started researching how disputes like this had played out in other communities. This was the point where our little turf problem began to morph into a full-blown HOA revenge story in my mind, not because I wanted drama, but because they had already drafted the first act without my consent. I found resources explaining that many states required associations to operate under certain basic standards of fairness and transparency, even if they had a lot of control over aesthetics. They could not simply invent rules out of thin air and enforce them without any written basis. The more I read, the more confident I felt that we were not crazy to push back. If the association truly had a hard color standard that outlawed our lawn, they should be able to produce it. If they could not, then their whole case rested on personal taste, dressed up as internal guidance. We decided our next move would be to gather more evidence. We went on a quiet walk one evening with our phones in hand, snapping photos of lawns around the neighborhood. Some were patchier than others, some more yellow, some greener, some showing clear signs of uneven watering. Not one of them was identical, no matter how much the association pretended otherwise. We were not trying to get anyone else in trouble, we just wanted proof that consistent color was more of an illusion than a reality. By the time we came home, our camera roll was full of subtle differences. Viewed side by side, it became obvious that our lawn did not dramatically stand out. If anything, it just looked slightly richer. If a stranger drove through, they might not even notice. But the president had noticed, and that was enough. The first real escalation came on Wednesday morning, one day before the Thursday deadline. We received another envelope, this time sent by certified mail. Inside was a document labeled Intent to Impose Fine and Suspend Privileges. It referenced our earlier notice of non-compliance and stated that failure to complete corrective action by Thursday would result in a $50 per day fine, plus potential suspension of access to association amenities. This time, they attached something more precise, a final notice dated June 2nd, printed in stark black lettering, with our address and a bolded line that said corrective action required by June 3rd. They wanted us to see the date. They wanted us to feel cornered. If we complied now, we would be spending $1,500 on replacement turf plus an unknown amount in future review costs, all to satisfy a preference we had never clearly seen in writing. If we refused, we would be stacking up fines at $50 a day, with the added threat of lost access to the community pool and the fitness room we were already helping pay for with our dues. The real question hit me hard in that moment: how much money was the association willing to bleed out of us before we either caved or broke? And how far was I willing to go to stop them from turning my front yard into an ongoing debt? I realized then that this was not just about winning or losing. It was about drawing a line they could not casually step over for every other homeowner after us. If we found a way to hold the board accountable for its vague, secretive standards, maybe the next family who wanted a small change would not be put through the same punishment cycle. We drafted another written response, this time specifically referencing the final notice dated June 2nd and the phrases, internal guidance, and acceptable threshold. In that letter, we requested a formal hearing, which our governing documents said we were entitled to before any fines could be imposed. We also asked that any evidence the board planned to use be provided in advance, including the exact standard sample and any records of prior approvals or denials related to turf color. This time, we sent the letter not just to the property manager's email, but also by certified mail to the association's official address. We kept tracking numbers and printed receipts, slipping everything into the lawn dispute folder. The stack of paper was getting thicker. That fact, oddly, made me feel safer. Their reply was brief but telling. They scheduled a hearing for 2 weeks later, noting that fines could still begin accruing if the violation was not corrected by the original deadline. In other words, they were holding the hearing with one hand while keeping the financial gun pointed at our head with the other. They also refused again to provide specific numeric standards, stating that the board will present its position at the hearing. At the same time, small social ripples began to spread. We noticed more neighbors glancing at our lawn, looking quickly away when we made eye contact. A few people who had been friendly before now seemed distant, suddenly too busy to talk. I learned from one neighbor that the president had mentioned, in a casual conversation near the mailboxes, that someone on our street was testing the limits and making it harder for everybody else. She had not said our names, but in a community this small, she did not have to. Our access cards to the amenities still worked, but I began to worry that would change without warning. The association documents said they could suspend privileges, for cause, after due process, but the phrase, for cause, seemed as stretchy as, acceptable threshold. The pattern was clear, vague phrases, hard consequences. I knew we needed more than feelings and photos if we wanted to stand a chance. We needed objective proof that our lawn's color was within a reasonable range and that the association was misusing discretion. That was when we decided to bring in someone from outside their system. We found an independent landscape inspector who specialized in turf and who, crucially, had experience dealing with communities like ours. We explained that we wanted a documented assessment of our lawn's color, quality, and condition, compared to standard turf options. We were careful to say we were not asking for legal advice or for anyone to fight the association for us, we just wanted data. The inspector came out on a bright, dry morning, carrying a case with instruments and a binder of his own. He took samples, measured color against a standardized chart, and asked to see the association's approved turf list. When I showed him CCR Section 5.2 and the related pages, he frowned slightly, then asked a simple question: where is the actual color standard? I could only answer that there was none printed, just the vague language we had already seen. He shook his head and noted that in his experience, communities that cared deeply about consistency usually had precise, written standards, if not in public documents, then at least in accessible policy manuals. The absence of such specifics, combined with references to internal guidance, made the situation feel lopsided. A few days later, his written report arrived. It described our lawn as within a normal range of residential turf color, highlighting that the variation from typical lawns was subtle and primarily visible under direct, close inspection. He compared it to several standard commercial products, some of which were even darker than ours. He concluded that there was no practical or safety reason to consider our lawn non-standard, and that any such classification would be based on aesthetic preference rather than objective criteria. We slid that report into the lawn dispute folder like a new piece of armor. It was not a magic fix, but it was something the association could not easily dismiss as internal or secret. It came from outside their walls. It spoke the language of measurements and ranges instead of feelings and thresholds. With the hearing date approaching, I knew we needed one more angle. Objective data was helpful, but I also suspected there was something buried in the association's own records that could help us. If they had ever approved a lawn with similar color, or turned a blind eye to one, that would undercut their claim that our turf was beyond the pale. I went back through our documents and noticed a small reference in the CCR index to a term I had skimmed before: variance. According to the text, the board could grant variances in certain situations, allowing homeowners to deviate from strict standards when justified. Variances had to be documented, and records of them had to be maintained for future reference. That phrase lit up in my mind like a flare. If variances were documented, that meant records existed. And if records existed, they were part of the association's official history, not some private, informal chat. I realized that somewhere in a filing cabinet or a digital folder, there might be proof that the board had allowed a similar or even more dramatic deviation for someone else. I submitted a written request to review variance records related to front yard appearance and turf. I framed it politely and cited the relevant section of our own documents. I did not accuse anyone of anything, I simply exercised the right they themselves had written down. It felt like pushing on a door I suspected was locked, just to hear how firmly the deadbolt clicked. Their response came 2 days later and was carefully worded. They said variance records were internal board documents and not subject to general homeowner review. They claimed privacy concerns and administrative burden. But what they did not say was equally important, they never denied the existence of those records. By this point, our situation was clear. The board had ordered us to correct a lawn that an independent inspector found normal, refused to show any exact color standards, and quietly admitted that similar deviations might have been approved in the past but kept behind closed doors. With fines looming, a hearing scheduled, and our neighbors whispering, the association's pattern of secrecy and selective enforcement was no longer just annoying, it had become the core of the fight, and the reason I knew I had to keep pushing back instead of quietly paying up. As the hearing drew closer, I realized that even if they had variances on file, they might never show them to us voluntarily. So I shifted strategy. Instead of chasing those hidden records, I started looking for visible signs of past exceptions. On our walks, we began paying special attention to anything that might have required board approval: decorative rock beds, accent lighting, unique front door colors, and yes, any lawns that looked even slightly off the standard template. We found one house near the back of the neighborhood with turf that looked strikingly similar to ours, maybe even a shade darker. The homeowners were an older couple who had lived there since the community was first built. Their grass had clearly been in place for years, and yet there was no sign of violations on their door or whispers about their non-compliance. In fact, their home had once been featured in the association newsletter as an example of excellent curb appeal. That detail stuck in my mind. If their lawn had been praised, not punished, then color alone could not be the true standard. Either the association's standards had changed without warning, or the board was using its discretion unevenly. Neither option made their case against us look good. We printed out a copy of that old newsletter page, highlighting the photo and caption about their curb appeal. We added it to the lawn dispute folder right behind the inspector's report and the final notice dated June 2nd. Each new document made the file heavier and the association's position feel just a little weaker. With the hearing date set for a Monday evening in mid-June, I spent the weekend organizing everything into a clear sequence. First, the architectural change request with proof of submission. Then, the conditional acknowledgement. Next, the notice of non-compliance, followed by the intent to impose fine and the final notice dated June 2nd. After that, the independent inspector's report and the highlighted newsletter page showing the older couple's lawn. Finally, printouts of our email exchanges requesting standards and variance records. The stack no longer felt like a pile of random papers, it felt like a story. A story of how the board had used discretion like a private weapon instead of a neutral tool. Walking into that hearing, I knew I was not just defending a lawn. I was exposing a pattern. The hearing itself did not take place in a courtroom or some grand official space. It was held in the association's small clubhouse meeting room, with fluorescent lighting humming overhead and chairs arranged in a stale semicircle. The board members sat behind a folding table, their binders stacked in front of them, while a clock on the wall ticked a little too loudly. The president sat in the center, hands folded neatly, expression unreadable. From the moment we stepped into that room, I could feel the imbalance. They had the authority to declare us compliant or non-compliant, to start or stop fines, to decide how our home looked from the street. We had nothing but our folder and our determination not to be steamrolled. But we also had something the board did not expect, a plan that did not end in that room. Because what they did not know yet was that while this hearing might decide our lawn's immediate fate, I was already preparing the next step, a step that would drag their internal guidance and secret variances into a place they could not control, and force their abuse of discretion into public view. The board opened the hearing by doing what they did best, reciting rules as if they were fact instead of interpretation. The president summarized the alleged violation, referring to the notice of noncompliance and the final notice dated June 2 as if they were neutral, inevitable paperwork instead of choices. She mentioned a photographic assessment, the internal inspection summary, and the board's responsibility to protect consistency, never once acknowledging that none of those documents included a clear, written standard. While she spoke, another board member clicked through enlarged photos of our lawn on a small projector, each image paired with that tiny color chip like it was a holy reference tablet. They treated the chip as sacred, but never explained where it came from or who had chosen it. They referred to the standard sample as if everyone in the room had seen it before that night, even though I knew we had not. The property manager read a short statement describing our turf as visually darker and distinct from nearby homes, phrases that sounded precise but were really just judgments in formal clothing. When they finally finished, the president folded her hands and turned her attention toward us, as if daring us to contradict the version of events they had just built. It was our turn. I took a breath, felt the flicker of the fluorescent lights above, and opened the lawn dispute folder. Instead of starting with emotion, I started with dates and documents. I laid out the sequence: our architectural change request, the conditional acknowledgement that never said no, the installation date, and the timeline of their notices. I pointed out that we had followed the process they published. I referenced the page in CCR section 5.2, noting that there was no numeric color code, no sample number, no actual chart in any homeowner-accessible document. I mentioned the board agenda excerpt that discussed lawn color consistency as a topic, pointing out that the board had time to talk about aesthetics behind closed doors but never clarified standards in writing. Then I slid the inspector's report across the table, explaining that an independent professional had measured our lawn's color and found it to be within normal residential ranges. There was a faint shift in the room when I mentioned that the inspector had compared our turf to several standard products, some darker than ours. One board member, the treasurer, leaned forward slightly, eyes on the report. The president, however, replied that outside opinions did not override the board's discretion, a phrase she seemed to enjoy saying. She called the report subjective, even though it was the only document in the room that actually contained numbers. That was fine. I had not shown them everything yet. Next, I took out the printed newsletter page showing the older couple's front yard, the one with turf that looked darker than ours. The caption praising their excellent curb appeal sat right under the photo like a quiet contradiction. I explained that this home had been praised by the association itself and had never been cited for its lawn. If consistency was the goal, then why had one darker lawn been celebrated while ours was targeted for elimination? The treasurer's expression tightened, and a faint murmur passed between two board members at the end of the table. The president brushed it off, calling the newsletter dated and suggesting that standards had evolved. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I reached into the folder and pulled out the document that felt like the missing puzzle piece, a copy of a variance approval the older couple had quietly handed us just days before the hearing. They had found it in their records when we asked, a single page titled Variance Approval, Turf Color, signed by a former board and referencing their address. It granted them permission to install turf with a darker green shade as part of a pilot landscaping adjustment. I laid that variance next to the newsletter photo. The room went very still. The variance proved that the board had explicitly allowed a non-standard lawn color before, memorialized in writing, with signatures and dates. It also showed that, at least once, they had recognized that strict uniformity could bend when it wanted to. I did not accuse anyone of hiding it. I simply noted that this variance was part of the association's history and that it undercut the claim that our lawn, by definition, violated some unbending standard. If they were willing to grant flexibility once, then their rigid stance with us looked less like principle and more like selective enforcement. The treasurer finally spoke up, asking quietly when the variance had been issued and whether it had been considered during our case review. The president replied that the variance was old and no longer reflective of current standards. But the variance itself did not say it expired, and no policy in our binder mentioned that older variances could be ignored. They had created a quiet exception for one homeowner and then tried to erase that history when it became inconvenient. Seeing the document on the table, with its neat signature lines and clear language, made that impossible to deny. In that charged moment, it became clear that the board was standing on shaky ground. If they insisted on punishing us now, They were not just risking a disgruntled homeowner, they were inviting someone outside this room to ask why an organization so fond of internal guidance had such a hard time explaining its own inconsistencies under oath. The board called a brief recess, stepping into the hallway to talk. We stayed in our seats, listening to the low murmur of voices beyond the thin clubhouse wall and the faint rattle of the air conditioner. When they returned, the president announced that they would take the matter under advisement. They would delay immediate fines, she said, but the violation would remain active until the board reached a final decision. On paper, it sounded like a pause. In reality, it was a stall. They were buying time to figure out how much risk they were willing to take. We left the clubhouse that evening knowing two things: the board was rattled, and the hearing had been only the first step of the plan. A week later, their decision arrived in yet another white envelope. They had chosen a compromise that made them look reasonable while still holding power over us. They waived past fines that had accrued on paper but insisted that our lawn remain non-compliant and that we still had to replace it. If we did so within 30 days, they promised no future fines related to this issue. It was a clever, calculated move. They framed it as a favor, hoping we would feel relieved and grateful enough to give in. Instead, it confirmed what I already suspected: they did not want their discretion tested anywhere they could not control the narrative. They wanted to keep their internal thresholds and hidden variances in the shadows. That decision pushed us to the next phase. We had tried internal processes and gathered evidence. Now we needed to put that evidence somewhere the board could not ignore it. With help from someone experienced in these disputes, we prepared to challenge the association's enforcement in a venue where internal guidance did not carry the same weight as written rules. The day we walked into the courthouse, the atmosphere felt nothing like the clubhouse meeting room. The echo of footsteps along the hallway tiles made every movement sound louder, sharper. Instead of fluorescent lights and folding chairs, the courtroom had tall windows letting in muted daylight and a quiet, steady hum of activity from other cases on the docket. This was not the board's world. It was a place built for records, questions, and consequences. We were not there to ask anyone to rewrite our community's style. We were there to challenge how the board had applied its power to us specifically: vague standards, hidden variances, and a demand for $1,500 based more on preference than policy. With guidance, we filed our challenge and brought our folder, the architectural change request, the conditional acknowledgement, the notices, the final notice dated June 2, the inspector's report, the newsletter page, and the turf variance from years ago. Every piece of paper had a purpose now. The association appeared with their own folder and an attorney to speak for them. The president sat beside him, posture rigid, lips pressed into a narrow line. Where she had once spoken with easy authority in the clubhouse, she now seemed content to let the attorney lead, her power translated into formal phrases and references. But regardless of who talked, the facts remained the same. The core of our argument was simple: the association had the right to set standards, but they did not have the right to enforce unwritten, secret ones in a way that treated one homeowner differently from another. We showed that no numeric turf standard appeared in the publicly available CCR Section 5.2 or in any homeowner materials. We showed that our request had never been clearly denied before installation. We showed that an independent inspector found our lawn within normal range, and that a prior variance and a newsletter praise piece proved that similar or darker lawns had been accepted in the past. The attorney tried to rely on discretion, arguing that the board had broad authority to interpret aesthetics. He referenced internal guidance and standard samples, just like the property manager had done in emails. But this time, someone else was listening closely and asking questions. The judge wanted to know where, exactly, the turf color standard was written down for homeowners to see. The association could not produce a single page with a clear color code or numeric threshold. They had photos of our lawn next to a sample chip, but no record showing when that chip had been adopted or how homeowners were supposed to know it existed. They had the power to declare us too dark, but no transparent system to show where acceptable ended and non-compliant began. In a setting built around evidence, that gap mattered. We did not walk out with a fiery, movie-style speech or a gavel-pounding climax. What we walked out with was more subtle and, in its way, more satisfying. The judge's questions made it clear that the board's case rested on a foundation of secrecy and inconsistency. Before any ruling was finalized, the association's attorney requested a recess to talk settlement. In a quiet conference room off the main hallway, the attorney's tone shifted. Away from the formal stage of the courtroom, he spoke in practical terms about risk, time, and the board's exposure if this dispute continued. He acknowledged that the lack of a written standard and the existence of that turf variance made the case complicated. He also acknowledged, without saying it quite so bluntly, that if this went much further, the association might be forced to change more than just one homeowner's lawn. We did not ask for anything outrageous. We asked for the violation to be withdrawn, for all fines and threats tied to our lawn to be cancelled, and for a written agreement that no enforcement would occur based on turf color unless and until clear, written standards were adopted and made available to all homeowners. We also asked that the association reimburse our out-of-pocket costs for the independent inspector and the filing fees. After some huddled whispers and calls back to the board leadership, the attorney conceded. They agreed to withdraw the violation entirely, to cancel any record of non-compliance related to our lawn, and to cover our documented costs. Most importantly, they agreed to formally review and revise CCR Section 5.2 to include clear, accessible standards for front yard turf, and to summarize any variances granted going forward in a publicly available log. It was not just a win for us, it was a forced shift in how the association wielded its power. The president looked tense as she signed off on the settlement language, her pen pressing hard enough to leave a slight impression in the paper underneath. She did not apologize, and I did not expect her to. Watching her name appear under the agreement was more satisfying than any apology she could have given. The aftermath unfolded slowly over the next several months, like watching paint dry in reverse. Our lawn stayed exactly as it was, deep green, even, and quietly defiant. Instead of violation notices, we started receiving dry, procedural updates from the association about ongoing policy review and clarification of guidelines. Eventually, they sent out a revised version of CCR Section 5.2, complete with actual, written color references and a clear statement about how variances would be recorded and summarized. They never mentioned our case by name in those updates, but the timing spoke for itself. Neighbors began to notice the changes. Some came by, more openly now, to ask what had happened and how we had managed to keep our lawn. We did not give them a legal seminar, we just told them that sometimes, the only way to handle overreach is to make sure someone outside the gate gets to see how it operates. The president's grip on the community loosened after that. At the next election cycle, several homeowners who had been quietly frustrated for years finally stepped up and ran for spots on the board. They did not campaign on wild promises, they simply talked about transparency, fairness, and respecting both community standards and individual autonomy. When the votes were counted, the president lost her seat as board leader, though she remained a homeowner like anyone else. The new board was not perfect. They still enforced rules, still sent reminders about trash cans and holiday decorations, still insisted on certain paint colors and landscaping boundaries. But they also responded to questions with actual references instead of vague phrases. They made variance summaries available in a simple document anyone could request. The binder full of covenants, conditions, and restrictions remained heavy, but it no longer felt like a secret weapon. As for us, we paid a price. There were months of stress, stacks of paperwork, and the quiet tension of passing the former president on the sidewalk, each of us nodding just enough to be polite. The experience left a mark, the same way a deep root can crack a sidewalk over time. But every time I stepped out onto that front lawn and felt the turf under my shoes, I was reminded that we had taken something back. We had pushed against an abuse of power that could have easily gone unchecked. We had turned a demand for a $1,500 correction into a line the association could no longer cross the same way. And while our little patch of deeper green might look ordinary to anyone driving by, to me it will always be a quiet reminder that petty control only works when people stop asking questions. Tell me your lawn color HOA horror in one line below.